The hot sun blazed down into the green field that was lush with grass, teeming with life, and home to so much more than just worms and roots. Pristine white clouds danced with purple and gray ones, a perfect dichotomy between the day and coming night. A girl sat on top of the hill, gazing at a wind farm far in the distance. She closed her eyes tightly as a tear attempted to escape down her cheek. A loose fishtail braid snaked from her scalp and draped against her back. Ratty split ends lay matted against the crisp red bandana that covered her mouth, and smears of foundation were smudged across the fabric. Black hair drooped like ink against her caramel-colored skin. These were memories of a simpler time. Scars and burns hid below the crimson facade, thinly veiled in her mind, ready to blow away with a weak gust of wind. Jaggedly, yet still softly, a piercing noise ripped through the air, shattering the serene silence. Her eyelids shot open, revealing her striking blue iris and a dull glass eye. Red veins bulged from the white of her eye as her head turned toward the sound. Her body remained still, crouched, bowing to the windmills. She looked at the old farm as she began to descend the hill and walk towards it. This is where her family used to work in the early autumn mornings and play in the blazing violet summer sunsets. It had a windmill too, though her father had always corrected her, calling it a wind pump, saying very plainly that there was, in fact, a solid difference between pumps, turbines, and mills. So now, despite her old habit of referring to it as a windmill, she held herself back. Seeing the two side by side, though, it was finally clear to her what he meant. Windmills were used to grind grain into flour, while the old wind pump had the job of pumping water from the ground, and it used to be a shiny silver color. Now it was rusted and weathered. The wind turbines were striking and new, and they used wind energy to generate electricity. Their stark white and slender bases protruded upwards like the nose of a snob dressed for an affluent dinner party. Despite their uniform appearance, there was one turbine that was different from the others. It donned red stripes that were painted across its 3 rotating arms. Something about its difference filled her with intrinsic anxiety. A gentle caress of wind shifted her concentration back to the noise and back to the old farm. She saw that it was indeed the rusty relic of time that had been the source of all the chatter. Though there was no reason for her to be, she was surprised that the old wind pump was still exactly like the last time she saw it, save for a fresh coat of patchy rust. Though its lifespan had long been outlived, it still kept trying to turn. Every now and then the wind would move the vane and the vane would move the props, just enough so that it would scrape against itself. The resulting motion would produce the sound of 1,000 screams trailing into the sky, but it never did much more than that. The girl's bony fingers raked through her hair as clumps flew out into the wind. She knew exactly what it felt like to be pushed to the very edge and still have to keep going. A sigh escaped her clawed mouth as she embraced the antiquated old pump. Her ragged breaths cascaded into waves of uneven panic as the squealing came to a halt and the pump stopped again. This small little plot of land was all that her family could afford to keep, and now this was all she had left. Like a flash of lightning, an old memory of her father climbing to the top of the pump and lubricating its inner mechanisms pulsed into her brain. Year after year, she remembered how steadily he climbed up the rungs of the tower, replacing this part and fixing that one. The thought filled her with love and warmth. Even though she had almost been 16 at the time, she was petrified of heights. She still wanted to help, though, so he would climb back down and hold her hand, telling her that one day they would go up together and that it wouldn't be so scary then. Her smile greeted his, and he took whatever tool was in her outstretched hand. Years would roll by of this routine, and no matter how many times he would fix the pump, it would always break when the winds got too high. This got to be so bad that at one point, the lever designed to help turn the rotor head broke, meaning that there would be no way to move the blades out of the wind's direction without going up there yourself. Since her dad couldn't even afford regular maintenance, much less fix the damage it might cause if it fell over, he thought that it would be best to climb up the tower himself and turn it away from the wind before it started picking up speed later that evening. It wasn't the smartest plan, nor the safest, but they were going to need that pump once the heat started rolling in, and it wasn't like he was going to be up there forever. The girl smiled persistently through the pain of her tightened skin and stitched gashes. As her breathing returned to normal, she realized that more time had passed than she thought. The orange and eggplant-colored sun began to set, but the normal symphony of crickets and pond frogs had not yet started. It was too quiet. Dark storm clouds pushed in from the west, and that was when she heard another sound emanating from the very hillside she had climbed down earlier. It was the steady whirring of the new windmills. She hated how much they reminded her of the old pump's dilapidated state, or the cold machines that had kept her father clinging in between the sick balance of life and death. In its current state, against the direction of the wind, the pump's blades no longer turned, and its gears hardly moved. It was but a ghost of its former self. Nostalgia began to overtake her once more. She thought of her dad and his calming, booming voice. His hand grasped hers as they stood overlooking the grassy hills that their family had once owned. Back then, they were free of noisy wind turbines. At first, she was scared, but then he reassured her, just before he slipped. She didn't remember much from that day, but she did remember the thudding, sickening crack his back made when he fell. This was the accident that left him in a coma for a little over a decade, and most of her life. Well, that was true until 3:24 that very morning when he went to be with her real mother. In tandem with her flashbacks, thunder sounded in the distance, enveloping her mind in a state of sheer terror. She ran into the old barn and slammed its splitting wooden doors shut. A legion of thumps stabbed into the aged yet sturdy walls. Rain. The roof leaked like a broken faucet. Cold water splashed onto her scalp, causing her to reflexively retreat. Scurrying to the light switch, she dutifully flicked it on. Surprised that it still worked, the yellow bulb made something small glint in the shadows. Sitting next to a collection of half-empty jerry cans was the hand mirror that had tormented her childhood and self-esteem. Unlike the lights, she wasn't surprised that this still worked. Walking towards it gave her an unfortunate glimpse of her present, while also sending her back many years to the past. She raised the cracked, sticky surface to her face. Back in the days of the farmhouse, beauty had always been something she sought after. For her, though, it was never the realm of the physical that plagued her. The girl's family would always encourage her when she felt down, and there were always times that boys came from all the way across town just to ask her to prom, only to be chased away by her dad's shotgun. None of this mattered to her, though. She could never see herself as beautiful. The mirror might have lied to her every now and then, but her mind never did. It became somewhat of a contest amongst her family to see who could scare off her suitors the fastest. She even joined in one year, pretending to be possessed and crawling towards the boy, his flowers outstretched at first as a romantic offering, but then as a fearful shield. They spent so many nights laughing at the dinner table, imitating the funniest reactions to their scare tactics, but no one paid attention to the fact that, all jokes aside, she never actually brought anyone home. No friends, no special someone. For all her parents' love and care, there was a side of their daughter that she would never let them see. They would never see the shards of the hand mirror that she had accidentally broken one night. They would never know that her taping up most of the broken pieces was just a cover, that she kept a few shards behind her dresser, returning to them only in her darkest moments. They would never hear her silent midnight cries and pained moans as she laid on the flat roof outside of her bedroom window. They didn't know that she slammed the hand mirror against the support beams of the barn until she felt glass stick in her skin. She would keep it all locked away, pressed deeply into the hay-covered floors of the empty horse stables. They could never know that she couldn't stand to see her own reflection, twitching and writhing until it screamed and spat in her face. Before her dad's accident, before the breast cancer, and before all of the scars and burns, she had always hated herself. Now, as she stood before her tortured past, emaciated and bulimic in her present-day 28-year-old body, she realized just how good she used to have it. She had no idea just how much worse it would get. Her mind raced with how many times she would have jumped from her roof on all those cold, lonely nights. If only she had known that this is what she would become. If only she knew that it would never get any better. Bone-rattling rage boiled inside of her and spilled out like a volcanic explosion as she climbed up the loft of the old barn. Water continued to drip down from up above, and it splashed against her scalp again and again. Her fist gripped tightly around the mirror, turning her knuckles white. She ground her teeth. The spongy wood creaked and squished against her bare feet. In the drier areas, she found splinters had started to wedge themselves into her skin, but still she kept walking. Outside, thunder banged against her head. The crack of lightning made her spine ache. She stared ahead at her destination, the old metal desk. Nestled inside of its drawers sat fashion magazines and old schematics for truck parts. She bent down and threw open every drawer until she reached the bottom one. With bated breath, she clasped her hands against the half-full can of lubricating oil, decorating her skin with singed marigold splotches. She noticed their slightly translucent appearance before she lazily wiped them off on her jeans. She delicately placed it on the desk as a nearby window let in a slew of rain that painted the moldy floor a darker, even uglier brown. The hand holding the mirror shook and twitched. She was going to do it. Now was her chance to finally end everything and throw the object of her suffering out of the window and into the abyss. Her reflection had gridlocked her entire life, and the simple mirror was the key holder to her cell. Her hand shook and writhed, but instead of her arm winding back or her fingers shifting their grip in preparation for a 100-mile pitch, she found her splintered, slippery feet moved forward with unparalleled ease. As she jerked towards the window, the leaky roof had seemed to follow her. 3 drops snaked downward and found their way onto her tender head. The old wood groaned and threatened to give in, even under the little weight that she possessed. However, she was unshaken and found herself at the window regardless. Her toes curled over the edge of the sill as her mind began to flick into the past like an old television. She hated being wet, and because of that she despised the rain with every fiber of her being. It forced in painful memories of what had happened to her time and time again, whether she asked for it or not. The scalding hot showers did little to help wash it all away. Despite this, she found that even now, as her life balanced on the thin frame of the old barn, she could not cry as Mother Nature could. The girl looked at the ground and then at her filthy toenails. They were jagged and covered in fungus, and the ones that hadn't fallen out yet were at least an inch long. The ripped blue jeans that used to belong to her dad loosely wrapped around her legs and blew in the wind. Where was her fear of heights now? Her heart pounded more than when she finally had her first kiss, and the intensity that had soon followed. As the wind whistled and the water splashed against her cold skin, she fought back nausea. Her arms stretched to either side of the window as if she were pinned on an invisible cross. Like the storm outside, her mind raged and screamed as her fingers gripped into the wood and chipped the old paint. Ancient pain raced through every one of her synapses as every memory, every mistake, and every decision she ever made flashed before her. It was all too much, but could she let it all slip by so quietly, so unnoticed? Her grip began to lessen. Her heart continued to race even faster than before. She felt the last of her life-clinging muscles ease. Up to that point, it had all been so. Both the girl and the mirror shattered into millions of pieces as they smacked the floor in unison. Realizing what she had almost done, and partly from shock, tears began to flow uncontrollably from her eyes as she apologized profusely into the darkness. Bits of glass pricked her skin as she slowly picked them out. Blood quickly trickled down, taking their place with ease. Suddenly, her gaze was drawn into the rainstorm by a familiar sound. It was hard to make out as clearly as she had before, but she could hear the old wind pump, still trying to shift. Her fingers trembled and her pulse quickened as she raised some of the remaining shards to her face. She couldn't remember the last time she had let herself look into her own eyes, and she was afraid that she would forget again very soon. Minutes went by as she just stared. She stared at the little girl who hated herself, and now at the woman who might as well have never left the old hand mirror behind. In another fit of tumultuous anger, she slammed the mirror into the floor repeatedly, crushing the shards with her feet and grinding them in her teeth. Blood filled her mouth as she spat again and again. What was left of the twisted reflector eventually did make its way outside. With a stare blanker than an abandoned canvas, she threw it and the shards out of the window with little thought. She undid her braids before she stood, and her bones ached and creaked. Looking in the direction of the old metal desk, she noticed an object that beckoned for her attention. Dad's old radio. It was probably even older than the barn had been, and with nostalgic childlike wonder, she raised the antenna and fiddled with its knobs. Like the waves of the ocean, its static washed over her. Fun memories emerged through the now garbled emergency weather reports and classical music, though the warning broadcasts would have been enough to startle anyone else in her dusty town. Her positive association with the bulky box was too great. She remembered how she would pretend to talk to astronauts on it, and how Dad would actually talk to truckers and sometimes pilots. Oh, how those days were fun, but they were over now. The last rays of sunshine set as her smile began to fade. She didn't remember turning the radio on, but she knew that she was going to remember turning it off. This too went out of the second-story barn window, but not before hitting the window sill and making a loud thud. Staring unflinchingly, she noticed that it had taken a sizable chunk of the floor with it when it fell. Turning away from it, she grabbed the oil can and descended back down the ladder. With zero hesitation, she unlatched the barn doors, and the wind did the rest. Spatters of water sprayed against her stinging face, but those days were over. She sauntered over towards the squealing metal wind pump, almost skipping. One hand wrapped around the rung, and the other clutched the canister with a death grip. The clouds in the distance had morphed from angry dark ones into chaotic swirling masses, ready to swallow everything she knew whole. Each move she made washed her atrophied muscles in pain, but eventually she found herself at the end of the ladder and at the top of the wind pump. With her arms raised above the machine, she held the can high and doused the gears in grease. The wind caught the blades quickly, but it still didn't turn. Frustrated, she poured the rest of the grease into the gear set, but still saw hardly any change. The swirling clouds formed into a vortex and touched down over the hillside. The rain stung her cuts and bruises and drenched every part of her soul. Screaming, she tossed the can at the barn in anger. The can's echo chuckled at her, forcing her to think back to the accident. Deep sadness reverberated in her chest, but this made her remember something important. He hadn't just fallen aimlessly from the rungs. No. It was after he had tried to push the vane back in the wind's direction. Across the field, the new wind turbines spun and sputtered. They rotated fast, mocking her failure, but now she found their jeering to be encouraging. The wind speed kept increasing, and the turbines kept turning. She ignored them. She ignored it. Gripping the rusty brown metal, the girl firmly pressed down and pushed with all her might. Prehistoric springs resisted her strength. Blood seeped from her palms as she inadvertently sliced into sharp protrusions. But again, those days were over. Those days are over. With the strength of her father, she pushed and pushed until she felt the gears become loose and limber, enough to sway. The giant vane caught the wind this time, and the blades turned to face the storm. Slowly at first, she watched as it began to spin, screeching as it did so. It jerked rapidly, almost sending her falling to what would have been certain death several times. As she finally marveled at her work, something familiar and mysterious washed over her. A tingling sensation traveled through her entire body, sending the hair on the back of her neck shooting upright. Goosebumps shot from her arms and legs as the sensation continued to spread. The hair on her head gently began to float up as well. The invisible force left a pit in her stomach, as her hair took the monstrous form of someone being hung upside down. Instantly, she remembered what happened to her cousin when she was 12, and she began feverishly racing down the ladder. Practically jumping from the tower to the ground, she sprinted south of the pump, where she ducked behind the bed of an old pickup truck. The blades spun rapidly, squealing in an area that she must have missed with the lubricant. The noise had never bothered her before, but something in the way that it cried out with every turn left her panicked and disturbed. Preparing for the worst, her face hit the dirt just as lightning arced down from the sky. White-hot plasma traveled straight into the wind pump, millions of times faster than a bullet train. The deafening explosion weakened the girl's resolve and sent one of the rotor's blades flying straight into the barn. In the next instant, the sound of splitting wood scraped against her eardrums as a small chain of explosions went off from inside. The fire expanded like a balloon of death and continued to feed itself hay and cans of gas. It devoured its kindling appetizers until it was so gorged that the next meal it set its sights on was the barn itself. The Auburn Inferno danced and laughed at the girl, guffawing at her terror. Unsatisfied with her lack of reaction to its joke, the charred skeleton of the barn screamed angrily and exploded again, sending pieces of squealing metal ringing throughout the land. Burning wood and sparks rained down into her hair, prompting her to clutch at it as she pulled out more clumps. A particularly jagged piece of debris whizzed by and sliced into her leg. Her body slumped against the wind pump that was still busy stabbing in her ears like a crazed killer. By now, the spiraling clouds had finally taken their full shape in the form of a tornado. As it roved across the field, ripping up fences and grass, the new wind turbines stood gallantly in its way. For just a moment, it appeared as if their gloating and tall, attractive features were protecting her. But she threw this idea away when she saw fiery sparks and thick black smoke pour from the propeller mechanisms. The turbines could no longer handle the speed of the twister's gale force winds. Some split apart at the propellers, while others just exploded. Some of them slowly began to sway, on track to tip. The turbine that the girl had been staring at earlier in the day had also started to sway, like a poorly rooted tree. Initially, she had noticed that it was a little too close to the power lines, but she continuously repressed the anxiety and fear that had caused. Now, it was impossible to ignore the reality that thrust itself into her face. She had spent the whole day trying not to think about what would happen if it began to fall. Now, next to the blazing barn, the ear-splitting wind pump, and the spinning twister, she knew that her fear was completely warranted. The tornado gently raised the red and white wind turbine above the ground and swiftly knocked it into a power line, ripping the cable from its tower. This sent explosive bolts of electricity buzzing in the air, heavier and louder than a championship deadlifting competition. This was it. After everything, it had finally come to this. Her bloody fingers ripped off the red bandana, revealing the full face of her injuries. Oozing stitches, reopened scars, and fresh burns laid over her oceanic iris. Her mouth spilled open, revealing her rotten teeth and calloused vocal folds. She screamed and retched, as her wig and botched hair transplants blew off somewhere into another era. She removed her glass eye as tears poured from her ducts, like the very rain drenching her entire body. Her fingers stretched back into her mouth, prompting her abused stomach to lurch, something it was all too used to doing. She puked forth her depressing breakfast of bile and air. The rain had long since washed away her mess of foundation, but she could still see remnants of it, dripping off of her shirt and into her tank top. It continued until finally it dripped into her cleavage. The power lines continued to twist and surge, ever closer to her, as the tornado closed in. The wind pump was now missing several blades. Like the deathly smile of a sick senior citizen, it squeaked and squelched, giggled and cooed. But through her screaming and heaving, she uttered her last words, right before the wind swept her away. "I'm sorry."